Alright folks, let me go ahead and get started here and we can start with our discussion. First things first, I need to disable something here. I need to disable some of my volumes here so that we can actually see the environment a little bit as it used to be. Let me actually go ahead and fix this so I can turn off things like, let's turn off the depth of field here. Turn off these effects here. Actually, sorry about that. Let me go ahead and turn this off like this, and we'll mess with the camera aperture, and then I need to actually kick off my post-process material. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a high concept discussion on what the landscape tool and an overall view of landscape. Now, the landscape tool in the Unreal Engine is the preliminary and also the default system that a lot of people like to learn before they get involved into other elements with landscape or environment creation inside of the Unreal Engine. In this particular example, we're going to look at a landscape and its creation process. We're going to look at what its use is. We're going to examine its use cases, and we're going to start looking at some of the tools here in the demo after. So give me a few minutes of your time, and we'll talk about a landscape and general game design production when it comes to landscape. Now, this course does not include a section on level design. The level design section is in the intermediate section. Level design is the practical theory of creating playable stages that entertain and amuse players so that they can have an experience that they're looking for as part of their game, and usually that comes in time with managing things like gameplay mechanics, so on and so forth. We're not going to talk about gameplay mechanics when it comes to our landscapes. We are going to approach this purely as a tools learning experience, and we are going to approach this purely as a understanding a new system in the Unreal Engine. Once you have that a little bit more down, it should be fairly straightforward as to what is actually happening, and then you'll be able to apply your knowledge in a grander sense to the information that you have. So this is mostly going to focus on the art, but is still going to introduce some concepts that are important to Unreal Engine. Now, let me be specific here about this. For those of you who had the opportunity to open up and play with the Valley of the Ancients, Valley of the Ancients is made using custom and not really custom, but cutting-edge technology related to Unreal's World Partition System. Unreal's World Partition System can be accessed in the project settings, but I'm not going to cover it because that's going to be in the intermediate course. The World Partition System is not inherently designed to play well with the landscape system. There are some questions, and have been some questions from students in the intermediate class, with how or what is the importance of learning the landscape tool if Unreal themselves doesn't use it in their key demo. And that is a really good question. Landscape, by and large, is still the system that has the most connections to external programs. So if you are using a program like Gaia or World Machine, you are developing a landscape in another program and importing it into Unreal Engine. In fact, it's recommended to do that, mostly because you have more access to creating custom maps and custom environments in those particular programs. Unreal, while still possessing a robust series of tools that allow you to make landscapes and whatnot, it still is lacking in terms of a full-on landscape interface. And if learning how to use tools like Gaia or World Generation, or what's a free one right now? Programs like World Machine do have free options and allow you to create environments that are fairly unique and very similar. As you can see the tools in the background, this gentleman is creating landscapes out in the middle of nowhere. These are special tools that can be imported into the Unreal Engine. World Machine still works. I know a lot of people prefer other engines, There are other websites that break down, let me accept the cookies here, that break down which tool is technically uh, the best per se. Um, Essentially, these are comparing the three most popular one: World Creator, World Machine, and Gaia, which has some element for how each particular system is going to work. World Machine is the only one that's free. I know a few people who are actually reasonably good at World Machine, but my argument is that the stuff that you are able to make in World Machine could be somewhat replicated by other systems inside of Unreal Engine. So if you want to spend some time learning World Machine, we will not cover it in this particular class, but it might be a good opportunity to learn some elements of using an actual game development pipeline. This is mostly a node-based system for generating and creating environments and height maps that can be unloaded and put into the Unreal Engine. Tools like this exist for a reason. Let's go ahead and move on the discussion from height map generation tools to how this actually works inside of the Unreal Engine. So again, Unreal Engine 5 has some new toolkits that are going to become more prevalent as the engine becomes more live. It's currently still in early access. Bear in mind that Landscape is the preliminary tool that I think everybody should learn because it has an opportunity to expand into other tools as well. Now, there are different workflows that do exist, and bear in mind that Landscape, as I mentioned earlier, is not compatible with some of the newer stuff that Unreal is using, but it is still by and large the way that the industry, at least for UE4, UE5, are producing game environments and will continue to be so until they get a new tool, so on and so forth. Now, this Landscape is constructed with a fairly older approach, but it still works for our purposes to explain how it goes. And then I have an example of some more modern stuff using some toolkits that are external to Unreal Engine. And then I'll break everything back down, and then we'll get started with the creation of Landscape and using the toolkit to make our own landscapes custom made. Let's go ahead and move around here, and I'm going to go ahead and view this from the top. And we're going to have a look, see what's going on here. Let's, yeah, this will be fine. Orthographic will be okay for this. What I have selected here, as you see over in the World Outliner, and I've modified my World Outliner a little bit so that we can see both our place actors and some of our world settings. The landscape itself is a section of information that's combined with a gizmo activator, both which work in tandem to create this particular system of geometry. Landscape is optimized to be a large, semi-sculpted piece of geometry that mimics an entire area of landscape. The landscape system inside of Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5 is a collection of tools that allow you to create expansive outdoor environments. Now, before we dive in, we're going to have to make ourselves familiar with some of the tools and some of the inputs, but we still need to understand overall what the goal of a landscape system is. Let's go ahead and go back to perspective view. The goal of a landscape system in the Unreal Engine is to provide us with a legitimate and tangible ground base by which we can operate in the game world. Collision is almost always by default, I would even say is always by default, initiated on a landscape system. On the landscape system, it is just a large, it's not necessarily a plane. Even though it looks like a plane, it has some benefits as far as optimizations are concerned when it comes to sculpting and developing the environment for your game. You will find your landscape tools located right here under landscape editing mode. We will go to this in a sec once we actually get done with this intro. Next to it, we have our foliage editing mode, and then some modes that we're not going to use for this particular section. So we're going to focus on these two tools right here. They're both activated by either clicking on them or holding Shift 1 or Shift 2 and Shift 3. The landscape is arguably its own particular system. Let me go ahead and go into wireframe view. that behaves in a way that is similar to a static mesh, but in and of itself has some dedicated performance optimizations that are specific so that the engine is able to, if not subdivide, then to create a general landscape that is going to provide you with a significant amount of detail and a significant amount of land clutter that allows you to give the game a feeling of having a continuing and long, or rather a continuing and spread out section of the environment. Now, you'll notice that the landscape does do some things as we zoom the camera in. This is part of the landscape system. A lot of this is actually going to disappear because I'm viewing an older UE4 style file in UE5. Active tessellation, which is what it's doing, or rather adaptive tessellation, which is what this is doing right now, is looking at being discontinued in UE5. In fact, it already is. But as you can see, there is some change that's happening. We'll be able to observe that in a new file once we actually have an opportunity to play around with it. You are not limited to having only one section of landscape. In this particular demo, you see that we have one landscape with a custom shape that allows us to kind of build out these particular sections, and these particular sections are all parsed by the engine for optimization purposes. Landscape is essentially the default toolkit that you should be using if you are going to be making a large landscape and you are still learning the landscape system. Unreal, in the Valley of the Ancients demo, has decided to use all megascans and the nanite system in order to create an environment that looks similar to a landscape, but in and of itself is not a landscape system. If you choose to use nanite for your environments, it is essentially limiting in some ways where you can no longer do things like sculpt, and you have to place a lot of elements manually. We're going to focus on landscape as a tool because it is the cornerstone by how we create game environments. The other stuff we will explore in the intermediate and in the advanced class. Let's go ahead and go back into our lit mode here. So as you can see, let me go ahead and hide some elements here. I went ahead and hit the static meshes here by going into show and hide the static mesh so that we can see the environment as a whole. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to, let's go ahead and go to lighting only. Actually, no, that one's not going to help us out a lot. Let's do unlit so we can see the environment as a whole. It looks terrible, doesn't it? The purpose of a landscape is not to have, my cat just sneezed in the background, I apologize, is not to have the best looking environment, but to have an environment that is legitimately a base for all of our art and assets. As you can see, the landscape can take some custom paint, and the landscape can be modified to showcase some elements that are sensitive to things like height and distance. There are ways to set up materials, especially landscapes, that are called auto materials for landscapes, or rather auto landscape materials. Let me show you an example of that now. Auto landscape materials can be used in conjunction with the sculpting and painting system of the Unreal Engine to automatically create things like crevices and rocks based on the height of the individual pixel and the individual height map of this particular system. As you can see, areas that are flatter do get some grass, and areas that are raised or have very intense sections get a rock slash bouldery type of material, and this happens automatically. Now, I'm not going to talk about setting up an auto material for this particular lecture because setting up an auto material in and of itself is its own lecture. If you are interested in setting up auto materials, I would strongly encourage you to look at stuff by Lincoln Hughes and to possibly download his. He has some free ones available on Gumroad. Making materials for landscapes is its own kind of endeavor, and we will cover it at some point, but we have to cover it at a later course because, well, there's just so much that we need to cover in terms of landscape that breaking down those individual systems is going to take forever. For example, we're not going to be able to do RVT or real-time virtual texturing or runtime virtual texturing because that in and of itself is its own thing. If you have no idea what either of those things are, you're totally okay. I'm just illustrating that the system that we're going to be learning today is part of a much more complex and intuitive system that we don't necessarily need to cover right away in terms of just trying to keep the difficulty at least nominal so people can understand what's happening. Back in the Unreal Engine, let's go ahead and go back to lit mode and have a look at how this environment works. Now, as you can see, our draw distance for our shadows is not set very high. This is for performance reasons. But as you can see, given the amount of post-processing and the way that the environment is working with the normal map on the ground here, we can see that this landscape is fairly well put together. It helps us kind of create an understanding of how this environment is going to look. It does, in fact, have the ability, this particular material does have some auto landscape feature. Let's actually, I'm going to actually go somewhere and demonstrate that here. Give me a moment. Yes, I know it's going to jump, but I'm doing an intro right now. We'll cover all these tools in a sec. So as you can see, this material is set up to receive and understand things like depth. So the deeper we go, we get some awesome changes. And if we build up things like little tiny mounds, we see that these mounds also blend into each other, so they create some elements that work for us. Now, this particular texture we're not going to use, mostly because these concepts are a little bit more advanced than necessary for this particular lecture, but just know that they exist. By and large, for our purposes, we're going to learn today how to create a landscape, how to paint it, how to develop it, how to add some foliage, how to start bringing in some elements, and how to start bringing in elements that are going to help build out the world. Let's go ahead and go back into show, and I'm going to go ahead and show use defaults here to show everything that's part of the scene. As you can see, most of this level is just a population of large assets. Ms. Figueroa, why don't we just sculpt things like this? The reason why we don't use the landscape tool to sculpt absolutely every element of the engine, or rather every element of the environment, is simply put, the landscape system is mostly just a placeholder system to allow us to create a vast level of detail and a vastness that is supposed to be the quote-unquote landscape. It does not have the capacity to do sculpts of this particular level. You can get something pretty convincing if you spend a lot of time, but if you're going to be spending a lot of time sculpting these kinds of shapes using the landscape system, you are essentially just wasting your time. These are just static meshes that are brought in, and in fact, these static meshes in the current iteration of Unreal 5, since these are being used for backdrop purposes, a backdrop meaning an area of the game that the player can't access but has the ability to see. So areas that are behind and outside of the gameplay area. The gameplay area is right here, but we can't actually get over here because of the water. The water would technically prevent us. These things are going to possibly be in UE5 imported as 9-eye meshes in order to preserve their high resolution, but also essentially just run phenomenally. And that's just kind of what the current iteration of Unreal Engine 5 is for. In order to create a convincing environment, you need to think about how your landscape and how your environment is going to build up to a much larger section. In this particular case, we can see how the landscape itself is augmented by the additional placement of static meshes and the additional places of things like positioning of things like foliage. Does everyone see that I just happened to click that one leafy guy right there and it selected all of these assets? This is part of the foliage system. The foliage system allows us to create with the landscape areas that we don't have to manually place trees or objects or anything like that. We also have access to a tool called the procedural foliage tool. That's going to be located up in the project settings. Excuse me about that. I actually went to the wrong thing. In the editor preferences, I apologize. And turning on things like procedural foliage. What this does is it turns on a system in the editor that allows you to create foliage procedurally. Now, I will be demonstrating this system later. We just need to know where to access it. We don't use the editor preferences a lot, because the editor preferences is how we affect that the editor is going to behave in a certain way. But funnily enough, I believe this should be a plugin, but it's not. We'll talk about it in the future. We also need to understand how to access our plugins. Our plugins are actually going to be what we are going to be using a lot of when we are building things out. Now, there are a lot of plugins related to environment and related to landscape creation, like landmass or water. These are all based on standard simulations. Let's see. They don't have that system anymore. But we have a selection of other plugins and tools that we can use to augment our particular engine, and we're going to be using at least a couple of them today. So again, showcasing where that is, we can go to Edit Plugins to open up the plugin window. We will be using some of these today, and of course we have access to different types of plugins. If you are curious about what plugins are installed on your particular engine, go ahead and load them up. There is quite a bit that's already loaded up in the system for what is enabled and what you can actually enable in your Unreal Engine system. Don't worry about all of these. I will tell you exactly what to turn on and what to turn off, but it's a good example of kind of the stuff that you can access to give you a little bit more leverage in content creation for the Unreal Engine. Lastly, before we move on to our own landscape creation, let's make an assessment of a standard game environment and see what a lot of these elements are supposed to be. Most of this environment is based on repeating the same buildings. Now, when played, let's see if I can play here. Oh, I'm falling. When played, a lot of the repeating behavior, like for example, there's only about maybe 1 or 2 different palm trees, and all of these ferns are slightly different and of a different type of height, and they're rotated slightly. Some of them are moving a little bit more than others, as you can see. Some are dancing, and some are fairly still. Most game environments are built on the notion that the player is at least functionally unaware at a high level that most of the environment is built off of repeating elements. Take a look at this environment and try to identify some of the repeating elements here. Go ahead and pause and have a look. The longer you stare, the more obvious it becomes. As you can see, the obelisk is the same environment piece. That weird center piece that looks like it has a hat is the same as that, is the same as that. I'm focusing above the character's head for those of you who are wondering. Those are all the same mesh, just altered in terms of scale. That is the same mesh over above the character's head over there. All these buildings are the same, except some of them are mashed up together. And let's go ahead and keep going. This wall is probably the only bespoke object. Here we are inside of a little bazaar. Don't be fooled. Those buildings are the same building, except that they have a fancy little towel kind of thing that hides them. That element repeats constantly. All of these buildings are functionally the same. Again, good game design and good level design is based on the idea that you can actually produce a level by using a minimal amount of assets, but placing them in such a way and in such a location that you can hide all the iniquities of the engine and hide all of the sameness by applying some materials that are going to be different. See this thatched roof? Appears multiple times. See this dome? It's actually just a piece that can be applied to any of the buildings. And just like that, we have a custom building that has like a dome that's not in the center. There we go. And it's that easy. This element repeats several times. In fact, This custom material is really just a cloth element with a texture that moves a little bit. All of these trees are functionally the same, spread out in different heights, and all of the plants are functionally the same, spread out in different heights. As you can see, when we select the foliage, we also seem to have selected some rocks. The rocks can also be placed as part of the foliage system. The foliage system is just an easy system that allows you to place things onto the layer of the landscape that allows you to paint them onto the ground. The foliage system, in conjunction with the landscape system, can help you make incredible environments in a short amount of time. Let me go ahead and hop to another content example, or rather, an example that I've worked on. Please mind the gap while I rebuild this. Unfortunately, I can't wait for the lighting to rebuild. This build is going to take something like 40 minutes, and I'm not going to spend the time doing a build. Now, this is made using baked lighting. As you can see here, we've got a fairly densely packed environment with a nice little lake scene. Well, mostly a river. And then over here we have some test stuff that didn't actually make it into the actual test. This is a custom spline. Let me hit G so I can turn off the game stuff. And you can see that this environment is actually pretty decent. A lot of this has changed. As you can see, there's some elements that need to be updated and fixed. But you can still see that there's a lot in terms of design, in terms of how this has been kind of built out. Here's the landscape, which is just your basic large square landscape with everything applied to it, texture-wise, material-wise, and plant-wise, that allows us to kind of build out this environment to look as good as it does. And again, most of the ground is actually just flat, and the foliage is what's doing a lot of the work for us. This is what makes Unreal Engine incredibly powerful in terms of being able to parse this information without having to run out of too much, without having to run out of memory or VRAM or overloading the Z buffer to allow us to render this at a reasonable clip, right? As you can see, the water does move a little bit, but this water is actually old. This was made using QBrush's toolset. And while we are not going to use QBrush, we have stuff that's even better now. We have Kixel Bridge. And with the ability to use Kixel Bridge and the onboard systems for things like water and whatnot, we're going to be able to make stuff that looks even better than this, probably as a demo tonight, and if not tonight, then during the office hour. I think you guys will actually very much enjoy it. Hey, I finally got 1%. I waited like 12 minutes to get that. Oh, we got 2. All right. I can't wait for this to build out, unfortunately. This is going to take too long to build out. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this discussion here at 27 minutes. In the next video, we should hop into a new project. So go ahead and make a new project. You do not need to have starter content. We can add that later. Just go ahead and make a new blank third-person project with no starter content, and we'll be able to actually enjoy being able to use some of the tools here, and we'll get started teaching how to make landscapes that look like this. And I'll see you guys in the next one.